So shalom everyone, welcome to another session by Moriah International Center. And this time, as part of a series about the ancient Near East, we are at the Archaeological Museum of the Philistines in the city of Ashdod. My name is Danny Herman. I'm an archaeologist by education. And today I wish to invite you for a fascinating journey back to some 3,000 years ago when the Philistines settled in the southern plain of the Holy Land and became the arch enemies of the Israelites. Such famous people for their battles against the Israelites that eventually led to the formation of the kingdom by David and Solomon. But what do we know about it archaeologically? What do we know about the Philistines from other sources? So this is indeed a fascinating subject where little bits of information have to be weaved in till we get the full picture. And the beginning should be not just in the region of the Holy Land, but over all of the ancient Near East in the specific time frame of the late 13th century. Up to that point, this land was ruled by Canaanites, a political arrangement of fortified cities which were independent. Each city governed its own area. They would sometimes battle once against the other. And the Egyptians were abusing the situation and kind of running the whole show. But by the late 13th century, something happens, and not just here. We hear of famines. There are some speculating that there were maybe volcanic eruptions, earthquakes. No one knows clearly what happened. But one thing is certain, the result. The result is that Canaanite cities decline. Egypt goes into chaos and diminishes. It loses its grip over this region. Mesopotamia, the area between the Euphrates and the Tigris, is also going into chaos. And the mighty Hittite Empire that ruled most of today's central Turkey completely disappears. What is causing all of this? In the Greek world, we hear also of unrest and eventually of a migration of groups of people that try to find safety elsewhere. And safety, I mean food, guaranteed food. And the Bible already tells us in the book of Genesis, if there is uncertainty about the sources of food where you are living, go down to Egypt. Because no matter how hot and dry it gets around here, the Nile will keep flowing. The Nile is not dependent on rainfall in this region. Its water is guaranteed by the upper elevated plateaus of Africa, today's Ethiopia and Eritrea, where the Nile is formed from Lake Victoria and on. And no matter what, there'll always be fresh water coming down through the desert that could irrigate fields and could guarantee wheat. Abram, Isaac, Jacob, in their time, they go down to Egypt for a famine in order to fetch food. They become enslaved, but at least food is guaranteed. And the sources seem to indicate that around the early 12th century, the whole ancient Near East again goes into chaos and causes these people to try and find their fortune, or find their food at least, in this region. This is not attested in the Bible. There are only hints about it, but we have two very detailed Egyptian sources that tell us this story. The first of them is a relief found at a site whose Arabic name today is Abu Simbel, where a king called Pharaoh Ramses III depicts graphically a great victory against what he defines as sea people, not a local rebellion, not Canaanites, not from the west, people coming from the sea. And they include warriors, but they also include men, women, and children, all trying to enter, to penetrate his land. But he fights against him. And the graphic images show very clearly how he turns their boats upside down, how he kills them, how he enslaves them. And then we have another source, a written source. It's called Papyrus Harris, in which the same Ramses III, inheriting the big kingdom of Ramses II, the most famous pharaoh, facing that challenge by smiting those people, which now we know their name, the Sea people, which is a cluster of different tribes. He calls them Sikelites, Denanites, Sharadunites, and Philistines. The Philistines, we now understand, were part of those sea people that tried invading into his land, but according to his very detailed testimony, he decimated them. He kills them. He wipes them out. He gets rid of them. But then he makes an agreement with them and he settles them in his fortresses. So actually his victory, his annihilation of those sea people was not really so complete, if at all. And what we seem to understand from that papyrus is that he ended up making an agreement with them to settle them in his fortresses, says the text. Doesn't say where they are, but to make an agreement that they will serve his interests and he will provide food, which is the reason they were here after all. And then steps in the Bible. What does the Bible tell us about those people, those Philistines? The Bible is only concerned about the one tribe of the Philistines. It doesn't mention the other ones, the other members of the sea people. But first of all, the name Philistine in Hebrew is reminiscent of the word polshim, invaders. Meaning the Bible tells us that they are, or indicates that they are not local simply by their names. And then in the book of Genesis, they are labeled as the descendants of the Egyptians. However, Prophet Amos in chapter 9 tells us, no, those Philistines are from Kaftor. Where is Kaftor on the map? There is no site called Kaftor, but there is a site, an island, a Greek island called Crete. And many scholars believe that the Philistines really came again from Crete and the Aegean world. But then is Genesis chapter 10 wrong? No, because as we've already learned, they are also relating to the Egyptians before they are settled here. So you need to weave in the bits and pieces of information of all the different sources combined to try to get the whole picture. And then what does archaeology tell us? For this, we will go on to the next room. So what does archaeology tell us about the Philistines? And first we need to go to the Egyptian sources, which are the earliest, clearest source about the sea people of which the Philistines were part of. And Ramses III presents a very detailed graphic image of those sea people trying to invade into his land, but he stands against them. And we can see here the Egyptians capturing those invaders who look distinctively different. Look at this person all tied up and the same person next to him. How are they different from the Egyptian person? The headdress. They have this type of crescent element, decorative element, or part of a helmet over their heads, but they're obviously defeated. You can see here those sea people falling off their boat, and the boat is upside down. When it is sailing towards them, it has a specific element of what looks like a lion's head. These are definitely people with a specific culture that are trying to invade the land of Ramses. And they are warriors, but also civilians, men, women, elders. But the warriors themselves are distinctively dressed and armed. And of course, they bring into mind the most famous Philistine warrior in Philistine history, maybe in world history, the man from Gath called Goliath. Later, he will appear to battle against David. How did he look like? So based on this image, this is of course a replica of the real one in Egypt. The museum here presents a presumed image of what may have been the image of Goliath. Only one slight problem in the scale, at least compared to me, he wasn't this height. What was his height? The Bible tells us Goliath was 6 cubits and a finger. And a cubit we know is about the size of a palm of a hand. So we need to measure 6 cubits up high. Ariel, I think I will need your help for this one, because I can do the first cubit. Put your arm above mine, no, higher, up in the air. That's the second cubit. Third cubit, fourth cubit, fifth cubit, sixth cubit, and a finger. The guy touched the ceiling, Ariel. Okay, so you have to stretch this image to get an idea of what the most famous Philistine warrior may have looked like. But I'm being distracted. This is just an image about what the warriors and the weapons and the armor of the Philistines might look like. What was their material culture when Ramses III said, you know what? Salute to me, be loyal to me, and settle the areas where I want you to be, and I will provide you with food. These sites, according to the Bible, would be 5 major cities along the southern coastal plain of the Holy Land: Gaza, Ashdod, Ashkelon, and inland, Gat and Ekron. And they all provided similar finds, at least in the foundation period when the Sea People and the Philistines settled in them. Let's take a look at this over here. When you're trying to define the culture of a civilization that is extinct for thousands of years, don't expect the science to provide much evidence about what people wore or what they ate. Those type of remains, they perish. And especially in this region, when you're talking about culture from millennia ago, what you find most of the time is the foundations of its architecture and remains of their containers, pottery. Something that humans discovered about 10,000 years ago, that you can mold clay to become a container, becomes in use by so many people, and to this day, we still use kitchenware sometimes out of clay. And the Philistines, as it turns out, had a very distinctive type of pottery, which also gives us an important hint, even more than a hint, I would say, about their origin. Just look at these items. They are found in the classic Philistine sites, and they are very different from the Canaanite or the Israelite pottery. First of all, they are very ornate. They are decorated, and they had the skills to use both black and red colors at times. But the decoration includes very, very specific elements like fish, and especially this bird, which most scholars identify as a duck. Why a duck of all birds, I don't know, but it appears both in Philistine pottery. It appears also in Philistine molded ritual objects. It apparently symbolized some deity or represented some force that they admired. Let's remember that a duck can both fly, walk, and swim. It doesn't do any of them really, really good, but it can do all of them. And maybe they admire that hybrid creature and so turn it into a symbol of capability. And speaking of which, what did they worship? Who were the deities, the gods, the goddesses of the Philistines? Also here, it's a fascinating topic. First of all, we have the Bible. The Bible mentions a temple in Ashdod where the chief god is Dagon, or a temple in Ekron where the chief god is Baal Zvuv. These gods are actually Canaanite gods, which is interesting by itself, as they indicate that the Philistines also adopted the Canaanite gods. But then we also have mentionings of Atzabim, whatever that means. Ashtoret, maybe a hybrid of a Greek goddess and a Canaanite goddess. And then in 1993, in the Philistine city of Ekron, we found an inscription where it indicates that a goddess called Petagaya was worshipped. So that archaeological discovery just taught us how much we still don't know about the Philistine culture in all dimensions. We know about their pottery, we know about some of its architecture. Many other subjects remains kind of obscure. And when archaeology digs up sites that relate to Philistine worship, we find all sorts of funny objects. For instance, right here, you have funny looking heads, molded clay heads. What do they represent? Or we have ducks appearing again, or we have hollow objects, apparently for running liquids for them. What kind of worship were those Philistines following? The Bible only gives us tiny bit of information, not enough to get a conclusive evidence. And another fascinating subject is the sphere of their influence. The Bible tells us of the 5 major Philistine cities. First of all, do we really know where they are all located? Let's have a look at the map. So where did the Philistines settle, and how far was their influence on a geographical dimension? Well, the Bible gives us the name of 5 major Philistine cities. Along the coast were Gaza, Ashdod, Ashkelon, and inland were 2 more cities called Gat and Ekron. If we can find those sites, we can tell where the Philistines settled. And the first 3 cities are kind of easy to figure out because they're with us to this day. They are inhabited, some very, very densely populated cities like Gaza, and then Ashkelon and Ashdod. Those are modern cities, and the archaeological mounds are at their edges, like in this case, in the city of Ashdod. Whereas Ekron and Gat, that's more of a riddle, because once they were conquered by the Assyrians, they were not settled again. And the name was not preserved in the Arabic language, in the Arabic place names later on, but archaeology figured out where they are. The site of Ekron was identified with 100% certainty in the 1990s when an expedition was excavating in a site called Tel Mukanna, which was Hebraized into Tel Mikne, the mound of the livestock. That also doesn't hint to the biblical name. But in the excavation of the site, the expedition uncovered a big rectangular building, which they suspected is a temple. And indeed, beneath it, they found an inscription in Paleo-Hebrew, whose copy is placed here on the wall, which says, Achish, son of Ada, son of Yaar, the minister of Ekron, has laid the foundation for this temple. The site has been clearly identified. This is the ultimate prize for an archaeological dig, to discover an item that will figure out what is the name of the site. So we now know with certainty that Ekron is inland and actually facing the Judean land. And where is Gat? I admit, we haven't found yet the smoking gun, the ultimate prize of another inscription, but the circumstantial evidence all seem to suggest that Gat should be sorted in a site whose Arabic name is Tel Asafi, or in Hebrew Tel Tzafit, which is not too far from Ekron. And it's worth noting that Gat was the hometown of Goliath, and the most famous battle in human history between two individuals, the famous battle between Goliath and David, takes place in the Elah Valley, which is just a bit east of Gat, or Tel Tzafit. So we're quite certain about the location of all of these sites. These are the 5 major Philistine cities, which the Bible admits are big cities settled by Philistines with an army, with a hierarchy, with a monopoly in metalworking. The Philistines apparently introduced iron making. The Canaanites are also called the people of the Bronze Age. We're not sure of how much the Israelites were capable of making metal tools, but the Philistines definitely could and had even a monopoly on this. Although I admit archaeologically we haven't found yet the metal smith of the Philistines, but I'm sure research will eventually discover that too. And this is one of the main sources for their exclusive power, and the fact that up to the Battle of David and Goliath, they always won. They always defeated the Israelites. And the most famous battle, actually there are 2 famous battles. The first of them is between the Philistines and Saul, but it doesn't happen here or even here. It happens up north in the ridge above Bet Shean, in the mountains of the Gilboa. That means the Philistines could send forces to battle even in the northern part of the land. And the other famous battle, by the way, here they also defeated Saul, and the shame was so big that Saul kind of committed suicide from being defeated. Another famous battle, also complete humiliation of the Israelites, takes place over the sources of an important water stream that today feeds into Tel Aviv. In antiquity, it ran not too far from Jaffa, and the sources were called Afek. The area of Afek was another place of battle between the Philistines and the Israelites. At first, the Israelites were defeated so badly that they didn't know what to do, and Eli, the priest in charge of the Ark of the Covenant, came up with a supposedly brilliant idea. Take the ark with you to the battle site, and this time God will be present. You will definitely win. Sounds like a good idea, except that there's a tiny little risk. What if they don't? And that's exactly what happened. On the second battle, again, the Israelites were defeated. Again, the Philistines were superior, and they not only won, they also confiscated the holy ark of the Israelites and took it into captivity. It traveled on a grand show in the city of Ashdod, the city of Gath, the city of Ekron. Eventually, the Philistines regretted that. It causes a plague, as it turns out, so they return it to the Israelites. But these stories display the power of the Philistines and the geographical range of their influence. They could battle successfully against the Israelites in the center, even in the north, and there's another battle that takes place northeast of Jerusalem. That's how far their influence went, at least at some point of time. When will it change? That will happen when there'll be another battle, when Saul is still alive, and he is about to confront another Philistine power invading into an area called Socho, which is in Judah. He comes to face him, but when both sides see one another, they cling to two hilltops, and actually both sides are now kind of stagnatized in their positions. How are we going to end this situation? At the end, they reach an agreement. Both enemies agree on one thing. Let's send one person from each side. And if our guy wins, you will become our slaves. If your guy wins, we will be yours. Sounds like a fair plan, except that then the Philistines present their big warrior, a giant, a mammoth, Goliath. 6 cubits and a finger was his height, about the top of the ceiling here, and 5,000 shekels was the weight of his armor, about 60 kilos. Okay, he actually needed an assistant because his armor was so massive. Eventually, the person that stood against him would be a young redhead shepherd coming from the town of Bethlehem, a redhead called David, who comes just to bring supply to his older brothers. He's not even a warrior. He's not even part of the army of Saul. But when he sees this disgrace that Goliath is standing there, and not only standing, he is cursing the people and their gods. He tells Saul, let me confront the giant. And Saul says, sure, go ahead, be my guest. And he does. He defeats Goliath. He becomes a celebrity. It's the first time that the Israelites are actually in any victory against this arch enemy. The Philistines run all the way to the gates of Ekron and Gath. And now David and Saul go into kind of a quarrel, but that's a different story. These stories again and again tell us of how the Philistines are the bitter enemy of the Israelites. And you know what? In a way, we should thank them. I mean, the Jews or the Israelites, because such an enemy forced the Israelites to unite. If you read the book of Judges, you see that when the Israelites take over from the Canaanites and settle in the land, they're sometimes in internal conflicts. When Deborah confronts the Canaanites and presents her famous poem at the end, it includes also debunking some of the Israelite tribes who were not participating. Why aren't you helping us? Or later in the story of the Benjaminite and the concubine, which they treated so horribly that there was an internal war as a result. That seems to indicate that the Israelites were not really united. It is the Philistines, apparently, who forced the Israelites that we better all unite or we'll all be hanged. And it is an interesting fact that David, after this defeat and after the death of Saul, he becomes a king that manages to unite all of the tribes and create this united monarchy with a new capital, Jerusalem. Okay, so the Philistines, their material culture, the historical sources all tell us a fascinating story also about the Israelites. But if we're trying to understand who the Philistines were, what was their origin, we debated this. We have discussed all the possible evidence. What was their material culture, architecture, religion? Okay, we figured out that they had their own distinctive elements in every dimension, but only in the first generation. The archaeology shows us that once David takes over, they are gradually declining. First of all, the city of Gath will be besieged and conquered by an Aramaic king called Hazael. Later, the Bible tells us of a Judean king called Uzziah, who rebuilds the Philistine cities but as Israelite cities. And the final blow will be by the Assyrians. Tiglath-Pileser, Sargon II, Sennacherib will all come in waves to conquer and to enslave also the Israelites, also the Ammonites, also the Moabites, but also the Philistines. And the final blow will be Nebuchadnezzar, the same Babylonian king that conquers Jerusalem, confiscates all its wealth, sends the Jews to exile. He apparently treats the Philistine in the same way, and they just lose their identity. Don't try to look for any Philistine walking among us. No one today makes such pottery, dresses with this crescent, or worships a Pedagaya. They simply disappeared, and frankly, that was also the fate of the Ammonites, the Moabites, the Aramaics. The question should actually be the opposite. How come if everyone was defeated at some point and disappeared, these guys are still with us? I'm a descendant of these people. The Jews did last traumas like exile and destruction. But that's a different series. We are trying to understand what happened to the Philistine over the centuries. We've discussed how they disappeared, but I still want to show how archaeology shows a few more dimensions of their culture and their material culture through discoveries of different disciplines. The reason I love archaeology, I'm so obsessed about this field, is because it's a scientific type of research that can yield so many unexpected finds. And in this case, archaeological research has presented so many more dimensions of the Philistine culture reflected through its material culture. The Bible tells us of the Philistines being foreigners, invaders, settling in a certain region, bringing their own culture, but gradually assimilating. It tells us of how they worship Philistine gods, but also Canaanite gods. And the archaeological research has presented that dimension in a similar way. First of all, we have distinct Philistine cultic objects that do not appear among the Canaanites or the Israelites. These cultic stands were of specific ornamentation and perhaps reflected playing musical instruments during the rituals. Another very, very peculiar item are these two, mini jars. Well, some scholars have suggested that they should be representation of phalluses. And it's an interesting note that the Bible is kind of obsessed with the fact that the Philistines are uncircumcised. That's often how he titles them, the uncircumcised ones. And when these were found, and we have a few more of these items, some have suggested that these are representatives of the proud genitalia of the Philistine male, and maybe they were even worn in some of their rituals. Okay, so on one hand, Philistine ritual objects, at first at least, is very, very clearly different and Philistine. On the other hand, later on, we find, in addition to those line-shaped figurines, four-horned altars. And four-horned altars appear clearly in the Judean rituals. And when it comes to cultic stands, then we have on one hand, this is a replica of a typical Philistine cultic stand with those ducks, duck heads. We already spoke about the ducks as a symbol in the Philistine religion, perhaps. Maybe it represented a goddess. But then this cultic stand is clearly Judean. We find it in archaeological sites of the region of Judea. So on one hand, the Philistines had their own. On the other, they gradually adopted the local culture, the local gods, the local language. In 1993, this is a replica of an inscription found in a Philistine city called Ekron. And we know it because the text says it. The text is indicating that this inscription was placed in the foundation of a temple that was built by Achish, son of Fadi, son of Yasad, son of Adda, son of Yar, minister of Ekron. And then it is for the goddess of Petagaya. We have a new goddess. We didn't even know that they were worshiping more than what the Bible tells us. So on one hand, it gives us another dimension of their religion, but then the language is Hebrew, Paleo-Hebrew. When they came and settled in this region, they had their own language. But we don't have a Philistine Bible, and to this day, all we found of Philistine writings is a few letters. We don't know clearly what they spoke, or it was probably some Aegean dialect. But by the 7th century or 8th century, depends when you place this inscription, they have completely assimilated with the Israelites, at least in the way that they worshipped. We even have a section in the Bible where an Israelite king comes to the temple of Ekron to be cured. So there was a very interesting love and hate relationship between those two entities. Yes, the Bible mostly reflects hate and battles. But if a Judean king comes to be cured in a Philistine temple, that tells us something more positive about their relationship. And you know what? It starts also at the very beginning. The book of Judges, reflecting the Israelites as separate tribes and the Philistines settled in the southern coastal plain, tells us of a figure called Samson, who was raised by his parents to become a Nazir, a man that should not be touching women or wine. And boy, does he do both. He's very strong, and at some point he will beat up Philistine people, but then he will be courting with Philistine women. One of them cost him his life. His love affair with Delilah ended up being captured by the Philistines and being blinded and placed in their city, but we all know how it ended. He demolishes the temple where he is presented, killing the Philistines that are with him. But it's a love and hate relationship which is reflected in the book of Judges, not so much in the book of Samuel, but even in the days of David, who smites Goliath. Later, we are told that he goes to Achish, king of Gath, when he has some issues with Saul. So the love and hate relationship, the cultural assimilation, what fascinating topics that we unveil through reading carefully the Bible and unearthing finds coming from the Philistine sites. The Philistines is a fascinating topic. They cannot speak for themselves because their own writings, and I'm sure they existed, did not last. We only have what this and the Hebrew Bible tells us, and we also don't have a clear record of how they disappeared. But they did. The Philistines are gone. The region was later renamed Provincia Palestina. It has nothing to do with the Philistines anymore. It was done by the Romans to punish the Jews in the 2nd century for rebelling against them. And to this day, the local Arabs of this region define themselves as Palestinians. But they do not worship any of those gods, and they do not use such type of items. Most of the culture of the Arabs of this region is Arabic language and Muslim religion. Okay, so you have to make that distinction. And what can we know more about the original Philistines? I believe that the archaeological research still has a lot more to tell us. And thankfully, the research continues all the time. And who knows what might be discovered in the following years that will give us a great new insight about this fascinating group of people.